Some people decorate their houses with colourful vases stuffed with flowers, Norman Rockwell paintings, knickknacks and crystal sculptures of dolphins and fairy princesses. I prefer to cover my walls with freaky drawings, paintings and prints of artworks by Francisco Goya, Anthony Christopher and Salvador Dali. The weirder and the darker the better. I like my art the same as my novels, horrifying and unsettling. So when my friend Marcus sent me the text with the title, "Check out this painting of a creepy old lady," I laughed and clicked on the link without too much thought. I was redirected to an obscure foreign website where old and new paintings were being sold in the never-ending online auction. I hadn't heard of this auction company before, but that didn't stop me from pulling out my credit card as soon as I saw the image that had been shared with me. A woman's hypnotic and bizarre face stared back at me, looking lifelike and yet utterly surrealistic, not to mention terrifying. Her pupils were too big and black, her smile stretched out too wide, like a Dr. Seuss character, but devoid of any kindness or good humour. It was a portrait of an elderly woman who appeared to be in her 70s or 80s. She was dressed in dark, monastic-looking clothing, which I guessed to be a couple of 100 years old. I figured it was a reproduction of an older painting, since the price tag was only $50. The style's similar to a Renaissance painting, the brushstrokes well hidden, her face photogenically realistic as if painted by an old world master. The woman in the painting was sitting on an antique wooden chair, with embellishments carved into the post of the backrest. Her eyes seemed to follow me and look back at me maliciously. The impression I got was that she was a real person staring back at me from the portrait, like glancing through a window and seeing the face of an unknown stranger standing just outside. I felt as if I could reach through the screen and grab hold of me if she wanted to. Without hesitating, I put my credit card details before somebody else could buy it. This thing was just too weird to pass up. After a week or so of waiting, the parcel arrived on my doorstep. I'd semi-forgotten about it by that point, since I'd been too busy with other things. But as soon as I saw its distinctive flat rectangular shape wrapped up in brown parcel paper, I remembered my impulse purchase and bought it inside with a giddy delight, happy to unwrap it right away. As soon as I had it open, my heart dropped and I felt sick, like I could throw up. I'd rarely felt buyer's remorse, but I definitely did when I looked down at the woman's face staring back at me. She looked alive. She looked undeniably evil. I couldn't explain why I felt that way, but I did. The idea of hanging this thing up on my wall repulsed me. Just touching it felt like a handful of maggots and it made my skin crawl. After putting it down, I wanted nothing more but to get rid of it, but it felt wrong just to throw it in the garbage. I've never been that type of person, especially with art. It didn't matter how creepy it was, someone had to put time and effort into it. Yeah, it was far more too disturbing to hang up on the wall in the living room where I could see it all the time. More than just disturbing. I seemed to be having a physical reaction to it like I'd never felt before. A growing knot in my stomach and rising sensation in my gorge. I went into the kitchen and took the oven mitts from the top of the fridge, picked up the portrait with them and held it out in front of me as if it was radioactive. I brought it down to the basement of my house and set the huge giant frame down against the wall of the floor, thinking I would leave it there for a while, until I got used to it, telling myself out of sight, out of mind. There was no way to get it out of my thoughts though. I kept seeing the woman's face every time I blinked, her glassy black eyes and too wide grin. I couldn't sleep a wink that night thinking about her down in the basement. I felt like I could almost hear her moving down there, the gentle creaks of her footsteps stepping quietly across the floorboards, but that was impossible, I told myself. Those things were too impossible. Still, I didn't sleep, not even for a single second. The following night I went down to the basement to do laundry, after building up the courage all the way to go down there. I walked past the painting. The woman's stern black eyes seemed to follow me as I went by. Her entire body was cloaked in a shadow, the gloomy details of her face barely visible in the portrait's low light. It was late at night and I lived alone, so I was more than a bit freaked out. That's when I heard something loudly topple over, when I turned my back to her. That caused a shiver to run up my spine. I dropped the laundry basket and spun around to look. She was staring at me from the place in the portrait. She had not moved, and yet her eyes seemed to follow me in the faintest movement barely noticeable with the naked eye. There was something else too. A box had toppled over, spilling its contents to the chair beside the painting. Yet I had not stepped anywhere near it to disturb it. The woman's smile seemed to have grown wider as well, strangely. Crooked teeth started to peek out from underneath her broken, bloody lips. Had those looked like that before? But maybe that was just my imagination. I decided not to look closer. I imagined her slowly climbing out of the painting as I leaned closer to inspect it, crawling out of the frame like the girl in the ring and racing towards me quickly on all fours. Shaking that image from my mind, I picked up the bin again and reluctantly turned away. I quickly put the laundry basket in the washing machine and turned it on, and walked past her again on my way back upstairs. This time there was no mistaking it. Her grin had stretched wider, and beneath that I saw a long row of teeth, dirty, crooked and utterly inhuman. I was very sure it hadn't looked like that before, but was I seeing things due to my lack of sleep? I wiped my eyes and blinked, examining the painting again. No teeth, and yet I'd been so sure a second earlier. Unable to stand looking at it for one more moment, I decided to do something. My heart was beating rapidly in my chest and my hand was shaking as I reached down and flipped the painting around, so that it had to face the wall. Her smile seemed to shrink a little bit, her eyes following my hand, brows furrowing up as she looked at me, reaching over the top to grab the picture frame. My skin crawled again when I touched it. I fought through the urge to retch and spun it around quickly. When she was facing the wall, I felt no better, only more uneasy, as if I'd turned my back on a deadly enemy. Again that night, I heard someone in the basement walking around from room to room. I was just glad she didn't come up the stairs, but I had a feeling she would, and very soon. That whole night I stayed awake listening for the footsteps. Every so often I would hear them, and every so often there would be a titter or muffled laughter, bemusing or unsettling. The next morning I called my friend over. I needed someone else to look at it, to make me feel less alone, I suppose. I was hoping the presence of another person would make things better somehow, but I was dead wrong. My friend Brent came by and I brought him down to the basement immediately. He took one look at the painting, which was now mysteriously tipped over facing upwards, and he walked straight out of the room saying, "Nope." He went back up the stairs and out the front door of my house, and much to my amazement I followed him and stood with him on the front steps. Brent was out there with his hands on his knees, bent over, oddly looking out of breath. But when I realised he wasn't just short of breath, he was completely terrified. Where the hell did you get that thing?" he asked, his speech fast and stuttering. You can't keep it. You can't. It's fucking evil. It's possessed. It looked right at me. How can you sleep with that thing in your house? Brent hadn't stuttered like that since back in elementary school, except the odd time when he was really stressed out. He'd seen speech-language experts for years and he eventually cured himself of the speech disorder, and it only really came out when he was really upset. I haven't slept a wink since I got that thing." He looked me dead in the eyes. "Get rid of it." I told him I would, with every intention of throwing it in the trash or burning it after he left, but for some strange reason I just couldn't do it. I decided I had to do something with it first. I had to find out some answers. The next day, after another restless night tossing and turning, I brought the painting out to the car. We were just going for a little drive together. I'd wrapped it up in a blanket and the portrait was covering up so nobody could see it. Mostly because I didn't want to look at it, especially whilst I was driving. There was an art expert about 2 hours drive away from my house. I'd looked him up online and found out he was well-established authority on all things creepy and disturbing. I'd taken a while to find someone with his reputation, the better part of the previous day in fact. While I drove, I looked back at the painting in the rearview mirror occasionally. From underneath the blankets I could have sworn I saw a subtle movement. The bend and the ripple of the sheet kept catching my eye and distracting me from the road ahead. It could have been the wind, but it wasn't. I was certain of it. Fast forward to arriving at the art specialist. "So you've got yourself quite an antique, by the looks of it," the man said, beginning to pull back the blanket to reveal the gilded frame. I realised I was holding my breath, closing my eyes, waiting for his reaction, when he saw the horrifying woman in the portrait. But when he finally gasped in astonishment, I realised it was not a fearful sound, but one of admiration. Remarkable. Opening my eyes, I looked at what he was seeing. The face of the woman in the portrait was not the same. I did a double take and wondered for a moment if he had switched them out when I wasn't paying attention. But no. It was the same frame, same woman in the portrait, only her expression had changed remarkably. Instead of the horrifying smile, she now wore a benign look on her face. A passive, good-natured smirk that I was accustomed to seeing on her. Magnificent. That's a technique which involves heavy-handed use of shadows and darkness with the light. In case you aren't familiar, but the brushstrokes, my goodness, utterly invisible, he said, holding up the loop to examine it closely. It looks as if she's alive. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this. Do you have the provenance? The what? I should have known the word. Did in fact, but I was far too tired to remember what it meant at that moment. I'd now gone nearly 4 full days without sleep and was dead on my feet. Any idea of the origins or its age? No, sorry, I got it at this online site, I said, pulling out my phone and trying to show him. But the website no longer existed as far as I could tell. Weird, I guess it's down right now. I'll send you the URL. He thought about it for a few minutes, going over the painting with various tools and magnifying lenses. "Ah, there's something," he said excitedly. What's that?" I asked. "Damn, I can only see part of the signature. I'll have to take it out of the frame. Can you leave it with me until tomorrow?" I agreed, unsure of how to explain the situation to him. Be careful with it. In retrospect, I guess I should have just said, "Poor bastard." The art expert didn't pick up the phone the following day, and I thought maybe he just needed more time with the piece. But I knew something was very wrong already. I'd slept for the first time in 4 nights, though, no longer hearing the footsteps creaking on the floorboards beneath me anymore. And I wanted one more night of peaceful sleep before hearing the truth from the man I'd left the picture with. Selfish, I know, but in retrospect I was just terrified to go back there, as who knew what I could find. After one more night of rest, I called the expert again, and once more I received no answer, no callback. Getting worried for the old guy, I now got in my car and started driving the first thing in the morning. I didn't eat breakfast, feeling like I would throw it up if I did. Despite the lack of food in my belly, it felt like there was a cinder block sitting inside of it the whole drive there. I just hoped he was okay. When I arrived at the man's studio, I found that the front door was unlocked. I entered the small foyer and found it dark and empty inside. He did not come out to greet me this time, and the sense of dread I was feeling continued to grow and swell inside of me. With slow, careful steps, I began to walk through the foyer towards the door where the studio was kept. And that was where I had last left him, and I hoped I would open the door to find him standing there working on something. I no longer cared about the painting. In fact, I hope he had destroyed it in my absence, that way I wouldn't have to. The last 2 nights had given me a clearer mind, and the sleep had afforded me perspective and insight to the situation. The thing had to be destroyed, but it had some power over me which had prevented me from doing so. I'd been tricked into hanging on to it and showing it to more and more people. Pushing the door marked studio, I went inside and into the next dark room. "Hello?" I called out in the blackened space. A soft gurgling noise responded. It sounded bubbly and wet. I reached over to turn on the light but found it no longer worked. The room stayed drenched in darkness, and then I heard the familiar titter of laughter, the same one I'd heard from my basement. It was her. My heart now pounding in my chest, I swallowed a dry lump in my throat, reaching for my phone. I pulled it out and tried with trembling fingers to turn on the flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I bent down to pick it up and heard movement in the darkness. It was getting closer. There was another sound as well, a soft drip, 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 like a leaky roof, only coming from several different places. Picking up the phone from the floor, I managed to unlock it, and I felt a presence move past me in the darkness. The air around me suddenly felt cold, like a winter's night. I found myself shivering and shaking, even more as I finally got the flashlight turned on. The light came on, casting the room in its white glow. A grotesque sort of art exhibit had been created in his studio, but not by the resident art expert who I'd met 2 days prior. No, he had not made this monstrosity, but he was certainly a part of it. The whole room was filled with his entrails strung up and down across the perimeter like party streamers. He was at the centre of it all. His body had been disemboweled and his guts had been pulled out and wrapped all around the room. His limbs had been removed as well, but they were nowhere to be seen. That was when I saw the most horrifying part. He was still somewhat alive. His mouth open and closed like a fish out of water. His skin partially missing from his face, revealing stark white bone beneath ligaments and tendons. Came from his mouth as I noticed his tongue had been removed as well, and blood was pouring out, causing him to cough and choke on occasion. The walls had been painted with blood which was everywhere. Various symbols which I did not recognise were on every inch of the room, ceilings, floor and wall. They looked druidic and ancient, and their meanings were unknown to me. As I looked around, I remembered the noise I heard by the door. I spun and saw her standing there in the darkness, the woman from the painting. She was dressed in a dark robe and her grin was wider and even larger than before. Blood was smeared around the room. In her hand, she held the painting itself, only she was no longer in it. The background was black and empty, now missing its subject. Realising suddenly what was happening, I noticed that her enchanting eyes were coming towards me. She was coming towards me. How long had I been standing there zoned out? The only thing which had snapped me out of it was the gurgling screams of the art expert, sounding desperate and terrified. She held the picture frame out in front of her as if to capture me into it. My heart beating fast, I did the only thing I could think to do. I shone the flashlight straight into her eyes, hoping it would be her weakness. A creature born of the shadows and of the darkness, I thought maybe even light would do something to stop her. And it worked. The second the glare hit her eyes, she put her hands up to shield her face, covering it with the picture frame. But her hands continued to burn and sizzle like a vampire in the sun. Still she continued moving towards me. Terrified, I backed up, tripping over a chair, falling to the floor. The phone fell from my hand and clattered away in the direction of the art expert. His face was lit up now, looking at me in its harsh glow. "Was Mitch?" he yelled, struggling to speak without a tongue, looking close to death from the blood loss. He was looking at the wall. I could see a light switch there. Struggling to my feet, I saw she was nearly on top of me, and heard her quietly whispering some sort of prayer chant under her breath. I ducked away as she brought down the portrait where my head was. I had the feeling if I hadn't gotten away, I'd be stuck inside the painting now, just like she had been. In the dull light, I managed to find the light switch nearby. I flicked it on, casting the entire room with harsh artificial light. The woman from the painting screamed, her skin boiling and steaming in the glow of the fluorescence. Boils and blisters bloomed and burst on her skin, pus and blood running out of her rivulets. Covering her face with her robes, she ran to the door and just fled like she was about to catch fire, judging by the looks of it. I hoped she would leave, but she didn't. Her footsteps stopped just outside the door. She's still out there in the foyer, waiting for me in the darkness, waiting for the sun to go down, waiting for me to try and leave. I can hear her pacing as she waits for me to come out, the next subject for her painting. The art expert is dead now. He stopped breathing a few minutes ago. It's just me left, with the bloody guts strewn around the room and strung up like giant intensile spiderweb all around me. The drip, drip, drip begins to slow down as his blood coagulates, and the blood-painted symbols on the walls begin to move and shift and morph as the one working fluorescent bulb in the room flickers and suddenly goes out. I really wish I'd just burned that damn painting.